courses. Very happy to be here. So this particular area that I'm going to talk about today is a city in China, but it's special for a few reasons, and I think worth your time, because it was one of the major reasons where Chinese civilization actually occurred. And it was the capital of the first emperor, and subsequently was the capital of 13 different dynasties, but especially the really big ones, the Qin dynasty, the first one, the Han dynasty, the second one, and the Tang dynasty, which is considered one of China's golden ages. It was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, the end that was on the China side, and we'll be talking about that. And during that period of the Tang dynasty, it was by far the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world, bigger than Alexandria. London, for example, would be considered a little town compared to this vast international city of Xi'An. Xi'an, by the way, means Western peace. The name is also changed a few times. It was once called Chang'an, which was basically everlasting peace. So the name changed every now and then, but we'll stick with Xi'an for that. And so where is it? It is really right smack in the north central part, north being defined as, above the Yangtze River. And as you can see here on the right in this map, these are mountains along the south, Jingling Mountains. They're old, kind of worn down mountains, but still mountains, and sometimes have snow on them. And then this area here is kind of highland plains, but it's that part of China that basically breaks the country into two, where the south is more semi-tropical and wet, and the north is very dry and getting drier, by the way, constantly. Desiccation and desertification have been problems for China. But it's tucked away in between this. So there were a lot of nomadic tribes in the north. Stay there for a moment. And they would raid different parts of China. But here, it's kind of protected. And it's also protected in the south. And in between is this river valley associated with the Yellow River, the vast Yellow River that begins in the Himalayas, as many of the rivers in Asia do. And there's a plain, a flat area, and the river brings the silt down from the mountains, which makes it extremely fertile. So it's a perfect place for humans to develop. It's also a little away from some of the other areas where some of the other competing regions were. It's kind of tucked off to the side, and I'll show you that shortly. To back up here, 4 great human civilizations. The Egyptian civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and Ganges, which is the one we actually know the little less about than any of the others, and Chinese civilizations. You know, these were the early civilizations, and what do they all have in common?
Graduating from Asbury, I was honored.
So in these four areas, the major thing that they have in common is rivers, huge river systems. So, Mesopotamia and the Babylon and the Middle East, the Nile, the Indus River, which is basically runs between currently Pakistan and India, but at one time it was all one big civilization, and the Ganges River. They were the sites of the early civilizations. So you to be successful, a civilization not only needed to be near water, but also needed to know how to use it for fertilization and how to of crops and how to irrigate them and avoid flooding if possible. Later on, they would be used for other things like transportation. I'm going to mention just here very briefly, because I think it's very interesting that Xi'An, that city, is also the site of an early Neolithic village. They refer to those because this is before there were towns, and they refer to them just as cultures, and this is one of the major cultures. There was a building being made just on the edge of Xi'an, a foundation back in the 50s, and the workers discovered some fragments of pots, and fortunately they didn't stop. They brought this immediately to the authorities, and it turned out to be the site of a Neolithic village, which has now been cleared and made into a museum site. One of the few things that we have from those early developments was their pottery. And here you can see in the center of this pot a face. And I just think that this is fascinating because this is an artist 6,000 years ago depicting a human face, really speaking to us from 6,000 years ago, expressing themselves. And it was, these civilizations, they buried their dead. In this case, they actually did it outside the village. They had a moat around the village. They had two kilns for making pots, and fascinating. Several fascinating things about it. They actually had they buried their very youngest children in pots inside the village, where all the others were buried outside, and females, particularly a group of females, were given sort of a fancier burial. There were, different jewelry and tools, and so it's thought that this might have been a matriarchal, a female-led village. Anyway, jumping on to here. So leaping ahead, we are now in the second Chinese dynasty, but it's still not yet have emperors. And there was a major war between different states or kingdoms. This was just a little bit after Confucius lived, and they were dozens at first, and then they would absorb each other, the stronger ones, and then ultimately down to 7. But there was one state that was on the side. It was looked down upon by the other states as being, barbaric and crude, but they had a plan, and they had a plan to take over all of the states, and it went several generations worth of kings in the Qin state. There's a story that one of the Qin kings died in a weightlifting contest. The other kings wouldn't consider in being involved with a weightlifting contest if that legend is really true. But eventually the Qin took over all of the others, and the king of that declared himself not king of everything, but emperor. And he's known as Qin Shi Huangdi. That's the first person of the Qin dynasty to be emperor. That's how the name is would be translated. And his capital he built right on the Y River, which is right across from where Xi'An is today. Jianyang is just a few miles from modern Xi'an. The Qin was important not just from being the first emperor, but also what he did. And his success came from his form of government. He was not Confucian, which believed, was in everybody has a place in society, and if the rulers rule with honor and take care of the people, and as an example to the other people, then all of society will fall into place. That wasn't their style in the Qin. They were based on harsh punishment. Here are the rules, here are the laws, we are going to enforce them uniformly. If you do what we want, we will reward you. That was usually in a military reward. And that philosophy is known as legalism. Quite different than Confucianism. And the way they also ruled was to begin to standardize the country with one coinage, one set of weights and measures. Even the axle lengths. Why was that different? The axle lengths of carts. Why was that important? That was important because the carts would go in ruts in the road, and when they got and those ruts were like almost like tracks in a railroad. If they got to the end of a different kingdom, they'd have to change carts because the axles were of a different size. He made that standard. The most important standardization that he did was to standardize the writing system, the script. They still spoke different languages throughout China, as they do now, but the script became the same, at least for official purposes, throughout the country. And that probably is the single most unifying achievement that he did for China. He also built roads, the early portions of the Great Wall. You know that the Great Wall isn't one wall, it's actually a series of walls, and canals. He did not accept any other views than his own and any histories other than for his area. So he burned books. There's a legend that he buried scholars alive that were, of the Confucius school. I don't know if that's true or not. Usually these histories are written by the next dynasty, and they tend to be very harsh on the preceding dynasty in order to justify their rule. But he was pretty harsh and severe in his rule. He said his dynasty would last 1,000 years. It lasted 16. This is still remarkable for the amount that he achieved in just the 16 years. But when he died, there was a competition for a whole new dynasty. Speaking of his death, there was in a later history of his dynasty a description of his tomb, and it was supposed to be just enormous, with lots of soldiers and servants and luxury goods there to assist the emperor in the afterlife. Now, we do believe that the tomb was started as soon as he was 13 and was in line of succession to become king of the Qin, and that's when they started building it. But 700,000 people, they were recruited, they were people that they had defeated, but this was all basically legend that appeared in the records just a couple hundred years after. So the actual author of that hadn't seen any of this stuff. So it was all sort of written down based on oral information. Nobody knows exactly where the tomb was, at least at that time, until 1974, when 4 farmers were digging a well and they saw a human face there. 3 of the farmers said, "This is bad. This is a bad omen. We better cover this up and get the heck out of here." The 4th farmer, though, reported it to the local authorities, who reported it to the city authorities, who reported it to the provincial authorities on up, and what turned out to be the most important archaeological find of the 20th century. And that was the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi. And all of the legends were not only true, but what they found is even more spectacular. And they're still finding stuff. It's a vast area of several square miles, but particularly what has been uncovered were these terracotta warriors. Historians didn't even know that this was a technology that existed at the time. Each of these warriors here, all were painted, and their details were different. In other words, they were unique. They probably weren't actually descriptions of copies of real human beings. And their bodies and different parts of them were standardized. They were put together kind of like a doll, but the faces were different. They were details so obviously some artisans were just assigned to make different faces, and then they were painted. What you see here are infantry. They had to, by the way, be pieced together. They were pretty much smashed up, but reconstructed, and horses, and they were officials. Here you see in the middle, this guy leaning on one knee. Why is he leaning? He is an archer. Now, originally they were all, you can see how they have their hands out. They all had weapons, and if they were wood spears, they've rotted away. If they were bronze weapons, they were probably pilfered over the 2,000 years. So not much has survived in the actual weapons. But this archer here, the detail is just incredible. You can't see the back foot, but the back foot, the sole of his shoe, is actually like a Nike running shoe in order to grip the ground. And that was reproduced in these sculptures. They all had hair knots, man buns, and the more you had, the higher rank you are. Over here on the right is a general. And in addition, there were chariots, but 2 special chariots. Chariots which are believed to be for the emperor. They're made of thousands of pieces of bronze, and it took their researchers years to actually put them back together again, but they're quite magnificent. One of them has a canopy, and they are about 1/3 the actual size, while the terracotta warriors themselves are close to full size. So imagine if this is now a #1 tourist site, and you can go there to see them, and they still haven't actually excavated the actual tomb of the emperor, which was believed to have a ceiling with pearls to indicate the position of the stars, and oceans of mercury. Again, this is all from a description of a couple hundred years after this was built. But researchers are not yet ready to actually open up the tomb. I've always thought that if this was something in America, we would have made a TV special about it and jumped right in there. But Chinese scholars are taking their time to make sure that nothing gets damaged when they actually open it. Moving on to the subsequent dynasty, that's the Han Dynasty. Again, it was at the same region of the Qin Dynasty near modern Xi'an. In fact, the Han Palace, which was vast, is actually still within the city limits, but it was made out of compact rammed earth walls, and there isn't much that has actually survived, although they're thinking about making it into an enormous park. The Han was important as a dynasty in shaping the culture of China, and the Han people, that's the name of the ethnic group that 93% of the 1.4 billion Chinese belong to. They have about 57 official minorities also in China, and some of those are rather large in terms of numbers, but still very small as a percentage of the total population. And even a small percentage of 1.4 billion people is a big number. By the way, Professor Gao will have this talk on, we'll put it someplace on the internet if you want to go through it perhaps a little more slowly. So I'll have that available to you as a recording also. The Han Dynasty also produced a number of very important inventions. Paper, the seismograph for earthquakes, the wheelbarrow, the freestanding rudder, and many other inventions that occurred at that time that would affect the entire world. I think by far, paper is perhaps one of the most important inventions of all of human history, because at that point, not only could knowledge be shared more easily, later on China would invent movable type. When I was a kid, we were taught that the first book was that was printed was the Gutenberg Bible. And that's not true. That just really shows how Eurocentric education was, and to some extent still is. But China had developed a movable type long before that, the Gutenberg Bible. And but once books could be printed and paper was there for people to write down their thoughts, then there's an opportunity to be much more creative and share knowledge and information. And so I think that paper, which was invented around the year 100 in the Common Era, is important. Buddhism first came into China from India. Buddhism is one of the rare philosophies or religions, depending on how you look at it, that came from outside of China. And it was also a good period for Chinese economics. They expanded also into Korea and Vietnam and into Central Asia. but still were plagued by these nomadic groups that would attack from the north. That was a constant thorn in the side and made of the Han government, and a lot of resources were devoted to protecting that northern border. So you see here in the lower left, these are figures, a dancer on the left. These come from tombs. If it wasn't for tombs of these various dynasties and through civilizations around the world, we wouldn't have near the amount of information as to what actually occurred at that time. So they are time capsules that have been invaluable for historic study. And here you see visitors coming to the emperor's court in the painting on the right. There was some interim fragmentation in China, but the Tang Dynasty, as I said before, considered the golden age because of the high level of culture that was achieved, and also the sophistication of the government and the openness to ideas. So the Tang Dynasty is one of the most studied and revered in Chinese history. And the city of Xi'An was thrived. It became a place a center of commerce, but also a place of culture, and of course, that's where the center of the government was. Tang Dynasty was known to have good government, stable, and when you have a stable government, the economy can grow. And when the economy grows, then people have the time and the money to spend on developing their own culture. So literature advanced, art, painting, calligraphy, and other crafts reached a very high level during the peaceful portions of the Tang Dynasty. Buddhism caught on in a much larger way throughout the population. In fact, Buddhism is one of the ways that parts of China were again unified. And it spread to other parts of Asia at the same time. Here you see a fresco in the upper left. No, I'm sorry, a painting. And this painting here on the lower left is actually of a time that the emperor had to flee the capital. And here is one of the tricolor potteries. They call it tricolor, but it actually had more than just 3 colors. But porcelain also advanced here. So in all aspects of the culture, it reached a very high level during this peaceful and prosperous period of the Tang. One of the sources of influences, and both out of China and into China, came along the Silk Road, which was a means to reach other parts of Central Asia, and it stretched all the way with Chang'an, that's Xi'an, at the eastern end of this. It's the Silk Road, by the way, is a fairly recent term. I think about 150 years ago. They didn't call it that back then. It serves a lot more than it carried a lot more than just silk. And it wasn't one road. It was various roads that ran different directions. It depends on the time of year, because sometimes it was better to go up north. There's actually a desert, a high elevation desert, and sometimes it's better to go to the south, depending on snow and ice. in reality, when people traveled this road, it wasn't going from one end to the other like a caravan you might see in the movies. They tended to be um, Arab and Persian traders who would go more short lengths from one city or oasis to another and then exchange their goods, sell them, and then move on. Going east, the most common goods that China sent out were its silk, its tea, lacquerware, medicine, its pottery, particularly its porcelain. Silk became hugely popular in Rome, just as tea would later on be very popular in Europe and the Americas. It was so popular in Rome that the government was concerned that their money was going out, and they were concerned about the balance of trade. There wasn't much actual contact between Rome and the Chinese civilization, even though they were the Han. It was about the same time period. The Romans didn't even know where silk came from. Some thought it came from trees. It actually, comes from the cocoon of moths. But the Chinese silk producers were smart enough to make sure that it was kept a secret for as long as possible. What went back the other way? The thing that China valued most was horses, particularly horses from the northern area, because they were strong and they had the ability to be in battle for long periods of time without getting tired. They were big, and even though China had tried to develop this breed of horses, they weren't nearly as successful as were these groups in Central Asia. So that was the item that they revered the most. Glassware and other precious metals and spices and religious objects also came back into China. But the most important thing that went back and forth were ideas. And so different parts of Asia got to know how other cultures developed and what their governments were, some of their technologies, and their philosophies. So religious documents, particularly relating to Buddhism, go back and forth, particularly into China. So that was the most, I think, lasting result of the Silk Road. Here at the bottom is another item found in a tomb. The camels were, very important. So you'll see horses and camels in a lot of Chinese sculptures. Eventually, this route, which was not easy to travel, would become dangerous at times, and the potential to lose your goods became too high, and it was replaced by maritime routes once the technology of navigating the seas and the quality of the boats got better. That became faster and cheaper, so that killed ultimately the Silk Road. In a way, China has developed a new Silk Road with a program that President Xi introduced about 5 years ago, called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. And it's another way to connect China to other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, but also to Europe, Africa, South America. And this is a major investment. Maybe that'll be a future lecture someday, a major investment that China has made to reach out and build infrastructure projects all around the world in order to facilitate trade and to develop diplomatic relations with other countries.
Professor Stone, sorry for interrupt. I forgot to mention that we should leave for about 10 minutes or so for questions. Okay. So we know this event is until 1:15. So maybe about 1 o'clock or 1:05, we should open for questions.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
The city of Xi'An was laid out with remarkable thought and precision. This is early urban planning at a very high level. So about 1 million people lived inside the city and another 1 million lived outside the city. This layout still exists in a slightly different form. It had the feng shui orientation with the palace up in the north and government areas here, huge broad streets which still exist. They were lined with trees. They even had an irrigation system to keep the trees irrigated, and broken out into different wards. These wards, or little sections of the city, could be locked up, closed off if there was any trouble. The whole city had an enormous wall, you'll see that in a minute, and 2 huge markets, the east and west markets there. So very precisely planned. There were sections specifically for foreigners, and where they could have, a mosque or a temple. This is where the government was for the population of the entire country, which at that point was 60 million, far larger than any other country in the world. Still is. The palace, which was up in the north, was called the Daming, Daming as the great shining or illustrious palace, and Gong is palace. The palace is gone, as well as all of the other buildings. The grounds are enormous, roughly the size of New York City's Central Park. But it was completely destroyed at the end of the dynasty. China built, as in most areas of Asia, out of wood. And so the structures didn't survive. Their foundations were of stone, but nothing was left of the buildings themselves. The government of Shanxi and the province and the central government decided to turn that into a huge historic park. I actually played a small role with helping with some of the getting consultants for them on that. They visited New York City and parks around the world before they started, and they've laid it out. The only thing was this big gate, which is about 4 stories high. They reproduced that. Other than that, there's museums, there's an IMAX. They developed the area around it. So it's really quite amazing. And this here on the upper right is a model of what the original was like. And that was the palace, the Daming Palace at the northern end of the city. If you were to walk down the avenues of the 2 markets in Tang, China, in Xi'An, you could buy stuff from all over the known world at that time. There's spices, honey, which was not a product that the Chinese had developed yet. You could buy animals. You could, wool was also something that came mostly from the outside, different weapons, religious icons. All sorts of people and all sorts of items would be for sale. It would be a market like none other in the world. One of the things that I was just starting to research is, were you able to buy slaves in this market? And I'm concluding that although slavery did exist in China, it wasn't something that was sold and bought and sold like you might see in the slave markets, even in the United States. But that's an area of research which I still think needs to be explored. Diplomats came. There was a tributary system where China would basically protect the areas around if they pledged allegiance around China, if they pledged allegiance to the emperor, and they would be exchanges back and forth. Students, particularly from Korea and Japan, came to study in Tang, China, and of course, traders. Some of the traders stayed for a short while, and some settled down there permanently. So you had a mix of different peoples from throughout Asia, all the way as far as the Middle East. Arabs, Persians, Jews, Japanese. There was quite a cosmopolitan mix of people who lived in the city. Some for short times, and some made their home there. China's influence across the region was tremendous. It affects all types of all areas of culture of the surrounding countries, particularly in Korea, Japan, and Vietnamese. And one of the areas, very significant areas, was the writing system. The Chinese writing system was one of the first. It's probably the oldest writing system that is still in use. Egyptian hieroglyphics predates it, but it's not used anymore. The Chinese system is still in use. And the Koreans used it to write their language. It wasn't that they spoke Chinese, they used that language. And you can see here an example of a traditional temple in Korea that has the early characters of Chinese there. And Japanese used it to record their language, and still do. Here's a modern Japanese sentence, and here there are 3 Chinese characters. So Japanese is a complex system of 3 different writing systems all together. And one of them, called kanji, comes from the Chinese characters. As part of this influence, Japan, as an example, sent 19 missions throughout the Tang Dynasty era to study medicine. They sent important people, their officials, their priests, and students to study Chinese culture and their form of government, Confucianism, and particularly Buddhism, and technology. You could see here as a different kind of influence in the lower right. On the left is a painting of Tang Dynasty women in their clothes. And on the right is a Japanese painting of a woman wearing a kimono. So the style of dress, the kimono, was influenced by the Tang style of clothing. Architecture was another area. You saw this layout here, for example, on the right of Xi'An. The capital, it was at one time the capital of China. Nala was based on this same plan. Even the palace here, you can see, is in the northern part, broken down into wards. This actually, the one on the left is broken even in a finer grid too. And Kyoto, another city which was at times capital. It's still a magnificent city with its temples was also based on Chinese urban planning and Chinese architecture. This building in Japan in the lower right is, clearly modeled after Chinese architecture. And importantly, the government that was used in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam had a strong influence from the Confucius principles that that China had developed, going back even to the second dynasty of China. It was cosmopolitan also in the sense that it welcomed different ideas, including beliefs. So all of the different people that came were allowed to practice the religion. The emperor's job was not just to rule the country, the emperor was also responsible for the spiritual being of his people. So foreigners were allowed to practice, albeit under supervision. They were put in certain areas, but they could build mosques and temples, and they did in the city. There were a few missionaries that wanted to spread their religion, and they were tolerated. Hindus were probably the first to arrive, and then Buddhism and Jews. Nestorian Christians were a little later. This stone on the right side here is the top of a monument that's about 11 feet high, and it's the first record that could be found in China of Christianity in Chinese. These were Nestorian Christians. Nestorians were a branch separate from the Orthodox groups at that time, and but there's a record, and that record is carved into stone, and you can see this at one of the museums in Xi'An now. Islam developed later, and so the people came later. That would be in the 600s. Would be the earliest that they would have come, because that's when the Prophet Muhammad died. But they are one of the communities that stayed and developed in China. The Tang government relied on foreigners, particularly to help guard the borders. So the armies were staffed by people of various ethnic groups that came from Central Asia. Most of them are referred to as Turkic, from that region that later became Turkestan. And at one point, almost all of the generals were from this group. It's possible that they also may have picked people from outside of the Chinese community in order to avoid political rivalry, since they would be unlikely to try to make their way up into government, since they didn't read or write Chinese. But one of the major and most successful generals was named An Lushan, and at some point he felt threatened by the emperor and particularly the emperor's staff, and he caused a revolt known as the An Lushan Rebellion, and that really was a major point in China because of the China's Tang Dynasty, because it weakened the government, and it never really was able to come back as strongly. The Tang is famous for poetry. All areas of Chinese history have beautiful poetry. Goes back. Even in Confucius times, he would read what he referred to as ancient poetry. But the one that stands out is the poetry from the Tang Dynasty. And there are many famous ones there. Du Fu and Li Bai were among the most lauded from that period, but there were several. And scholars and the aristocracy would write poems, and it weren't necessarily meant for publication. They were usually sent to friends. And it was later that they were written down, and we only have a fraction of what they believe are hundreds of thousands of poems that were written during that period. We mentioned the An Lushan rebellion. The poet Du Fu wrote this during that period of time. The nation shattered, mountains and river remain, city and spring, grass and trees burgeoning, feeling the times, blossoms draw tears, hating separation, birds alarm the heart, beacons, fires, 3 months in succession. A letter from home is worth 10,000 in gold. White hairs, fewer for the scratching, soon too few to hold a hairpin up. What you don't know from reading translations is the rhythm and the rhyme schemes in these poems, which are, very regimented. And so all of this, the art of this is to try to evoke these feelings and still stay within the standard schemes. So, very interesting figure. All of the emperors were male. Chinese, by the way, is not a gendered language. So we would say emperor or empress, but in Chinese, it's the same word. But there was just one. There are many powerful women in Chinese history. They may have ruled because their children were too young, their son would be too young, and so they took control, and or their family was very strong in government. But only one ruled in her name, ZETIAN, and she was really quite successful. She had to have been extraordinarily skilled politically in order to hold this position for such a long time in a clearly male-dominated patriarchal system, both culturally and in terms of government. She succeeded in expanding the borders. She protected the borders. She was a deeply religious, devout Buddhist. She expanded the role of women. She commissioned a book on famous women. She said, now the mourning period for mothers, which was fairly short compared to fathers, is going to be the same as the mourning period for fathers. And she found ways for women to participate more in Buddhist ceremonies. There's no paintings of her from her time period. There's several paintings, but they're done, at least 200 years later. However, this sculpture, which you can't see it, but it's carved into the side from a mountain, not in this province, but about a 2-hour train ride away. This particular bodhisattva, the legend is that they used Wu Zetian's image to create the face. These are the Longmen kosher, the Longmen grottos. So fascinating figure, Wu Zetian. Subsequently, the histories would trash her because the next dynasty and the Confucian scholars were probably deeply offended that a woman had ruled the country, and so, but the historic evidence indicates that that she was a pretty good ruler. Tang art again reached a very high level. You see here again the camel and the tricolored. The calligraphy no longer was calligraphy just a means of recording things. It developed into an art form. It's sort of a cross between painting and literature, and there are many schools of art. This big painting here on the left is quite interesting. It's interesting because most of the riders you see here are women, and and they played, among other things, they played polo. So you didn't see that before or after in Chinese dynasties where women had such a role, and very likely ZETIAN was part of that. There is this pagoda you see on the right is one of the famous landmarks in Xi'an, and what it is the home of the work of a particular Buddhist monk. He was a guy who left Xi'an as a young man in order to find what he thought were better texts on Buddhism. He was not happy with the quality of the translations. Again, this is early in Buddhism in China, and he wanted to go to the source. So he snuck out of the city because it was illegal to leave without permission of the emperor, which he didn't have. And he traveled all throughout the South Asia and Central Asia, stopping at monasteries, collecting things. Some of the government people there had heard that this scholar was coming, and they helped him out. Sometimes he got into trouble and had difficulties, but his faith, he believed, kept him going. He returned 16 years later. It happened to be that the same emperor who was in power when he left was still in power, and he was amazed by the travels of this monk named XUANZANG, and tried to make him a government official, which he didn't want to be. He wanted to start translating these hundreds of Buddhist sutras or scripts into Chinese, which was not easy because they were written in Sanskrit, which had no relationship to the Chinese language. So the emperor built him a pagoda, one on top of the other. It's still there. It's still a monastery. Parts of it have fallen down during an earthquake, and parts were built back up again. But it's a major tourist site in Xi'an. I mentioned that it went also both ways, in that famous Chinese monk was brought to Japan. He tried to get across the sea in stormy weathers. He was invited by the Japanese government, and eventually, the sixth trip, he was able to make it there, and started a school of Buddhism, a sect at the time. He also went blind, so that when you see him here, his eyes are closed. That's because he had become blind in his old age, but still was very influential in Japan. Later, under dynasties, would move the capital, and so Xi'an became more of a regional center rather than the national center that it was initially. The Ming Dynasty, the second to the last, provided a lot of funds for building in Xi'an. And you see here two beautiful structures that are, again, symbols of the city now and major tourist sites, the Drum Tower and the Bell Tower. and they would sound the bell at the beginning of the day to and unlock the gates of the city, and the drum would beat in the evenings, like something like 45 times, indicating that there was an evening curfew. You needed to have a very good reason to be on the street, like a funeral or if it was a major holiday, but everything would be locked up securely. They allowed guards to see beyond the city walls. They continued to serve their function. Actually, even during World War II, they had served some functions later on when the city was bombed by the Japanese. But two magnificent buildings of almost same architecture during the Ming. I think most unusual is the city walls. Again, there were a variety of iterations over the years. So the one wall that you see here that exists today were restored, but they come from the Ming Dynasty also. Huge, massive walls. You could see the one down below, how wide it is. You could drive 2, maybe 3 cars along this, of these walls. They're up high, and there's a park around them. They have now big openings to allow traffic into the center of the city, which is the old part. Every time I go to Xi'An, I do one loop of this jogging of this 8.4 mile rectangle here, because you could see the old city on one side and the new city on the other, and it's just you're up very, very high. Sophisticated guard towers. By the way, the guard towers are set out at a distance between what an archer could shoot. So that's how they spaced them out for security purposes. During the warlord period and during World War II, people would go inside the bottom of the walls to protect them from bombing. So even in more modern times, they provided defense. I mentioned about the Muslims that came into the city, traders from Persia and the Arab world, and one major group, different from the Uyghurs in the far west, different ethnic group. These Huimin people, the Hui people, are assimilated into Chinese society, with the only exception is that they have a different religion. But other than that, they don't speak a separate language, and they are a vibrant part of the commercial life of Xi'An. This the Muslim quarter is just wonderful and just packed with tourists almost all the time. It's like one huge party there every night. The food is just fantastic. If you can see my shirt here, Xi'An food, and it's just a lot of fun to visit this part. You can buy all sorts of souvenirs, from beautiful peasant paintings to cheap alarm clocks with Mao Zedong's face on them. It's a fun area. My favorite place in the city is the Grand Mosque, which is inside the Muslim district. You have to go down a couple of winding streets to find it, and then you go through a wall, and it just opens up to this magnificent place. The gates are laid out. This gate on the left here. Again, they claim that the mosque goes back to the 600s, but the architecture is mostly from the Ming. The Ming court decided that it would help fund this, but you could see that that the mosque has a very different style than you would find, throughout the Middle East. For example, A minaret is where the call of prayer is from a mosque, usually a tall obelisk attached to a mosque. Here, it's a Chinese pagoda. And on it, you can't see it, but these are dragons. You don't see dragons on a mosque in too many parts of the world other than China. Beautifully laid out. The pattern of this mosque is one gate after another until you get to the sanctuary in the back, which is more of a Buddhist style. But this is a working mosque. They have religious schools here, but it's also a major tourist attraction. And just today, modern Xi'an is become a major city. It's not one of the huge ones like Shanghai or Beijing or Chengdu or Hong Kong. It's really an interior city, but it is thriving. It's particularly known for its universities and for technology. China would build technical parks, high-tech parks. By that, I mean buildings of which are laid out for software companies and hardware companies to start businesses, and they would give them free rent for 2 years if you can start a business. There's several successful companies there. There's actually, China has an enormous space program, which Americans just really don't know very much about. They have several launch sites. The major satellite tracking station is in the Xi'an region. I do a summer abroad program, and unfortunately not this last summer, but hopefully next summer, maybe some of you would be interested. We visited electric car factory, the largest maker of electric vehicles in the world, and one of their factories, which is, just enormous and mostly run by robots, is in this region. We visited Amazon, the Chinese version of Amazon. Again, packages were taken off the shelves. The shelves were 4 stories high, and they're all done by robots. Those are all businesses that are in Greater Xi'an here. This, you recall, was the beginning of the Silk Road in ancient times. However, the new initiative for the One Belt, One Road initiative, China's investment mostly in infrastructure in other countries, is also centered here. I took a group of students, for example, to see a train station that was laid out just for commercial traffic. It wasn't for passengers, and it showed on this wall a map, kind of like a scoreboard at a stadium. In real time, you could see, looking up, trains traveling along routes all the way to Italy, but throughout Central Asia and South Asia to see this. And so it was an example of this new Silk Road initiative right in front of us. That's a space. Particularly think that the current designers of Xi'an as a city have put a lot of effort into parks and green space. And it's really, there's many enormous parks there, for some with historic implications and others that are just green spaces that, that you'd want to see in every city around the world. That's what I got. So almost 1 o'clock here. Thank you for your patience and your attention. Yeah. Any questions out there?
Could you comment on the One Belt, One Road initiative?
This is a $1 trillion, thank you for your question, Colin. This is a $1 trillion investment there are over 700 projects. Some of them actually go back even before President Xi announced it. And it's controversial. Some countries object to the idea that China is locking up certain markets, and it's even controversial in China because it's an enormous investment and concerns that it's not well coordinated and maybe not worth the money. But what China is doing from a financial point of view is helping countries develop their ports and their rail systems, sometimes buildings and even schools. But the hope is not only to be able to acquire natural materials, and China is a huge thirst for particularly energy as it continues to grow. But if it can develop more of a middle class of some sort in, say, Africa, then these will be people they expect will start buying Chinese products in the future. There's concern that this often comes with a loan to these countries, and that some of these countries have not been able to pay for it. For example, one of the Greek ports, famous, goes back to ancient Greek times. Greece has not been able to make the payments, so they gave China an enormous lease on that, and other countries are saying, "Wait a minute, that's a little bit too intrusive." There's also been concerns that China does not follow necessarily the same pollution standards that the countries would like to see, and how they handle it. But many of the countries, particularly in Asia, welcome this because there's such a need for road and rail. And if they can connect, imagine, for example, a city in where the capital in Africa does not have a river system that brings from the center of the countries to the coast, quite like Europe, North America, or Asia. And so they need infrastructure to develop their economies and have rail systems, and China has helped them do that. So definitely controversial inside and outside of China.
Other questions? You can send your question in the chat if your mic doesn't work.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your time. You mentioned that they hold one of the largest EV manufacturing companies there. Do you know what their plans are for green, sustainable energy?
The President Xi, thank you for your question. President Xi said that China will hit its peak in 2030, and from then on, it is going to try to attain by 2060 to be carbon neutral. The first part of that China peaking in 2030 was not a surprise to the world, but the 2060 commitment by President Xi was really stunning. You know, the United States, on the other hand, pulled out of the Paris Accord, the environment. We'll see how President Biden does here, but China is kind of like the Saudi Arabia of coal, and it has such a need to supply itself with energy that it continues to build the coal power plants, but they also spend twice what the United States does in alternative energy. So the largest solar farms are in China. I think, was it 3 out of the 4 top windmill generating companies are in China. And you know about the Three Gorge Dam, the enormous dam that was also hydroelectric power. So they're working on it, and they're looking at new alternative energy sources. On quantum theory is a major area of research that China has. I actually asked the party secretary, the Communist Party secretary of a major portion of Xi'An, this actually district you see right here, about that, because so what happens, because growth is and economic growth is the priority. How do you manage that? And he said it'll always he'll always go towards saving the environment if there's any concern. But we know that China's air quality in its major cities and its water, fresh water, are both major problems for the country. As they become more middle class, the people are saying, okay, we were starving back in the 1950s, but now that we have a higher level of standard of living, we want different things. We want a clean environment, for our children. So they're investing at this in a large way, but they still have a long way to go. Specifically about electric vehicles, that's that company that I visited with the students. It's called BYD, which actually stands for Build Your Dream. So it's sort of a pun in English too. They supply electric buses through all over the world except for the United States. And they also produce forklifts. There was an experimental train that we saw that was an electric train. And they do trucks. So they see this as a huge area that China can dominate in the future. The head of the BYD company actually began by making cell phones batteries, and then had the idea of making car batteries and then cars.
All right, other questions, anyone?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Liam.
Could you talk more about the Chinese space program? Because this is the first time I'm hearing about like anything like substantial.
What does the United States have right now? The International Space Station is the latest one. The International Space Station is reaching the end of its life. A few years back, I think roughly 11 years ago, U.S. Congress said, this is an international space station, except for China, because they felt that China was stealing technology. And so the Chinese astronauts and Chinese were not given access to it. And that space station is, reached the end of its life. China, on the other hand, throughout these past years, is building its space station. And one great irony is, right around the time that the U.S. International Space Station is done, China's space station will be available. And they've announced in the United Nations that it will be open to all nations. We'll see if that includes the United States. They have 4 major launch facilities for big rockets and several smaller ones. The trajectory has just zoomed up in terms of their technology. They're still not at the level of the United States, but they're getting close. And they have compressed that, as they have in pretty much all areas of science, it seems, compressed this into a smaller span of time with tremendous effort and investment. They actually, and it's, the concern is that as in any country that's in the space program, that with it is a military component that has helped the government internally justify the expense. And China's missile programs has progressed also along the same lines. China's had a few tragedies, and it's as we have too. But, like everything else, they're working on it.
Okay, we have about several minutes. Anyone else who got a question?
I do. It's kind of a less academic question, but what's your favorite food from Xi'an? Do you have like any recommendations? If I were to go there, what should I try?
Yeah.
Yang Rou Pao Mo. Because of that that market here, because these are, the vendors are largely Muslims, they don't use the same pork that is throughout China. I mean, if you talk about meat in the US and you don't specify it, it's beef. And in China, it's pork. Why? I'm assuming, I never saw this written down, but I'm assuming because the United States has got these big prairie areas and in lots of space, and has much more arable land than China, even though the two countries, by the way, are almost exactly the same size, different configurations, but we've got, we can have cattle. And so if you've got restricted space, but you still want the protein and the taste, you go for pork. But these are Muslims. So what they use instead tends to be lamb or mutton. And they have a dish that, you can go just a few miles outside of the city, and you will find a regional food. Remember, this civilization is thousands of years. They would say it's 4,000 years old. So like India, they have a long established, cuisines, and it's very, very regional and immensely diverse. But this dish, this yang rou, which means lamb or mutton, pao mo it's kind of like a bread. And what they do is they give you, it looks a little like a big pita bread. And you were handed that one piece of bread, you tear it up yourself and put it into a big bowl. And then they put this amazing stew made out of lamb on top of it. And it has spices of, I think it was something said there's 27 different ingredients. At the fancier restaurants, they have somebody assigned just to work on it all night long and cook it. And so it's ready for the next day. And that's probably, if you had to pick one food, that would be it.
All right, thank you.
I have a question as well. Could you comment on the Catholic Church's involvement in Xi'an? I noticed that there is a archdiocese in the city.
Yes, well, the Catholicism came in the form of, early on, I'm not sure of the exact year, but it would be, I believe, there were some inroads early, but the major influx of Jesuit priests occurred, I think, not until the last dynasty. Jesuits tend to be the most scholarly of the priests' orders, and the Chinese really respected them, especially in astronomy. Astronomy, by the way, is very important in Chinese culture, at least in ancient times, because there were various things that were performed at different times of year, and it was considered a way to, keep heaven happy, is to perform the rites and traditions of that time. So that's the Matteo Ricci is a famous scholar from Portuguese who was Jesuit. He was made part of the court, and so that's the first inroads.
What was his name?
Later on, as after the Opium Wars, which is another story, foreign countries made China a semi-colony, and they, part of that, the Second Opium War Treaty gave them the permission and the authority to build churches, but they weren't well received by the population who thought that this was an affront to Chinese philosophies and ethics and cultures. But eventually, Chinese churches have arrived. Christianity does seem to be growing. There are house churches, and there are which people run out of their houses, which are unofficial. But the government does allow Catholicism, Islam, and Protestantism and Buddhism to exist. What they want, like many of the things that the party requires, it has to be registered, and there's a bureau for it in the Chinese government. When it comes to Catholicism, there's a difference where the government says we get to appoint, the cardinals, and the Vatican saying no, we don't go along with that. So the Catholicism does exist. It is legal. It's not a huge portion of the population, but it is, Christianity itself is growing. And I think it's growing because there's, the Communist Party is basically atheist, and they had decided during the Cultural Revolution to counter all forms of religion. As Marx said, it's the opiate of the masses. So religion, now there's a big void. During Mao's time, he was the religion. He was like the god. And after that, I think there's a searching amongst the Chinese people, in my opinion, as to some kind of void that they're looking for. Some have gone for spiritual areas, some martial arts, and I think they're still looking for something other than just making money in their lives.
What was the name of that Portuguese Jesuit that you had mentioned?
Matteo Ricci.
Matteo Ricci.
Yes, and there were others. He was just probably the most famous and successful. He was also remarkable because he learned to read Chinese, which is, Chinese was even harder back then. That's before the characters were simplified. And he started translating it. And then they realized that there was an enormous body of literature and philosophy that Europeans just had no idea existed. And this actually the same thing is true in other areas. Hinduism, for example, has this, again, an ancient body of literature. I mean, it would fill libraries of poetry and stories and philosophy. But when they started to read all of this stuff, they realized it about Taoism and Confucianism and Moism. They realized that there was a much more developed culture than they had realized. So he helped translate that for the first time. In fact, the name Confucius is a Latinization of the Chinese name, which would be Kongzi, old Kong, or Kong, that's his name, was Kong. So you could see that. It's Matteo Ricci. If you send me an email, we'll put that somewhere on a website. I'd be happy to send you stuff on it, but it's easy to find. And there's many books on Catholicism in China.
Very fascinating. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question.
Okay. It's about time. Thank you so much, Professor Stone, for a terrific lecture, and it's very interesting and informative. And we appreciate your taking the time to come to our club and give this presentation. Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for attending. If you want to view the recording, you can send me, or you can send our club president an email. I think her email is in the chat. Okay, you can copy her email and you can send her an email to request for the recording. Okay.
Also try to get a link in like a Facebook or Instagram post, see if we can do that, just to get it out there too. So
Yeah.
if you
Okay,
don't
yeah.
have access to it by tomorrow, just reach out to me.
Yeah, and I'm happy to take any emails that you guys want to, if you want to keep in touch. Hopefully, at some time we'll go when we have live meetings, in-person meetings. We'll get to meet some of you. But thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Just take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jen.